let's go ahead and get started. I know we've just had, if we're here in the room, we've just had lunch. So I will try to keep it peppy so that post-lunch nap doesn't come over us all. We have a ton of amazing backgrounds at this particular conference. And I am originally an interpersonal scholar who in graduate school, someone was like, oh, you could, are you gonna be like a tech com scholar or health com? And I was like, no, I'm interpersonal. I just do interpersonal. I don't do any of this tech stuff, don't care, etc. And then realized that if I wanted to study friends and it was 2007, 2008, then I was probably gonna have to study social media at least, and the way that people were engaging with each other via various technology channels. And so I really come to the idea of communication technologies as thinking through a channel for interpersonal goals, right? A way for us to achieve various goals, but of course not all channels are created equally. And when I think about social VR and when my work has sort of moved into the VR space, I think about why would people want to use VR as a communication channel? You can see my AI generated VR headset as telephone. And so that really brings up the question of why would we use any channel as a communication channel? And I think that for those of us who are interested in VR research, interested in presence and these sorts of things, there is the idea of VR as kind of an interesting context within which to, test out theories from a variety of fields. But there's also the question of, why doesn't it have a widespread adoption, right? A lot of the technical problems are really solved at a level that an average user can pick up a headset and use it. But why are we all on Zoom instead of VR, right? Why are we using other channels and we're not really getting into the social VR space? We are, but everyone who's not in this room. And so one of the theories that we think about in communication in terms of channel choice, we have lots of different channel selection kinds of theories, but there is this idea of theory of the niche, and it's a little bit older, but it's this idea that the social norms and structural components of a medium influence the space, right? The niche, whichever we want, that technology inhabits in the communication environment. So Dimick et al. Say that when people are going to choose to adopt a new technology, they are going to choose something that fulfills a specific gratification, but also like it's based on the features of that technology, but also the uses that people gravitate towards in that technology, which to me starts to sound a lot like affordances. And I know Dimick et al. Were really coming from a uses and grats perspective. Sometimes that gets put into conflict with the affordance perspective, but I think they can kind of work together. And so I thought that by this point in the conference, lots of people would have defined affordances, but we really haven't, right? We haven't gotten there. So I'm excited to bring something new to the table. So if you're not familiar with the concept, you can probably find like 30 years of arguments in various disciplines about what affordances are, et cetera. But we're gonna define them pretty simply today as this kind of inherent functional attribute of a particular object. And emerging between the relationship between the actor and the object. So I have this image here. It's not very technical, but you have sort of the user, and the affordance is not the user, right? But it has to match the things that the user is interested in doing. And the affordance is not the technology. It is not the iPad here. It is not the buttons. It is not all of that. It is in this grayish kind of overlay space between the technology and the user, and sort of the relationship that a user sort of develops with that channel. And so in some ways, it's based on what you want to do, but it can also be based on what the social group around you is also doing with a channel. I'm not the most amazing example, but one of my examples is when I teach affordances. For a long time, I was in the States, so it was at DePaul University in Chicago, and now I'm at University of Toronto in Canada. So when I teach affordances, I give students that classic example of the chair, right? And so here's the chair. What does the chair afford? And students are like, oh, it's got sittability, right? You can sit on the chair. I say, okay, what else? You can stand on the chair. Cool. What else? Oh, you can use the chair to put your laundry on, right? It becomes the laundry chair. Great. And when I'm in the States, I say, what else? And students start thinking about it. And someone says, I can use the chair as a weapon. And I was like, okay, sure, right? We can swing a chair around. And then someone else will say, I could use the chair to barricade a door. Sure, we can use a chair to barricade a door. When I started asking, the first time I gave this lecture in Canada, we got to, the sitting, the standing, the laundry. And I said, and what else? And the students were like, I don't know if it's on wheels. Maybe we can use it for like races or something. And I was like, and what else? And they're like, I don't know. And I thought, I was like, well, you could use it to like barricade a door. And they're like, why would we do that? I actually, right? I'm not upset to be sending my children to school in Canada instead of the US, right? So it is about some of that social context does matter to the way that we see the affordance, which means now we've got a lot of things floating out there in terms of the user, the social, the features, the design, all kind of coming into this idea of affordance. And then affordances, if we look at Evans et al., right, it can't be the object itself or a feature of the object. It's not the outcome, right? We can have outcomes theoretically from affordances, but it's not the outcome itself. It has to have variability. So within a particular object, it could be like, yeah, you can sit on a chair, but there's the idea that other objects would have more or less sittability, right? So you have to have some kind of variation. And really importantly, affordances are in the perceptions of the user, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Affordances are in the eye of the user, which can cause us some problems as folks who might want to measure affordances and think about how they appear in technology if we are not, and we cannot be, right, all end users everywhere. So we have to think about how the user thinks of these things. And then, of course, individual communication channels, moving off of chairs, going back to communication channels, right? Individual communication channels will have different constellations of affordances. And so I said that in a paper in 2021. And I would say, if we're thinking about theory of the niche, to drive adoption channel choice, you need to have a constellation of affordances that is unique from other channels. Otherwise, there's no reason for you to drop the thing that you are currently using and decide to use something else. And this particularly matters when we're thinking about social channels, because you also need other users to be on the other end of that channel. And when we think about channels instead of as affordances, this gives us a little bit of theoretical heft, right? So if you notice that first very simple slide with the iPad and the gray thing, and right, it's a model, right? Here's the affordance, here's the technology, here's the affordance, here's the user, and then we get to outcomes and effects as simple as it is. And so when we can think about instead of having a million studies that are like, again, showing my age, right? Facebook lets us do this, but MySpace lets us do this, and Friendster lets us do this. We can think about, well, they all have network association and they all have these other affordances, but MySpace has this affordance and Facebook has this one. And we can start to think through what is the affordance allowing people to do and how people are perceiving it, and then how they're using that to build social communication, which then builds out from there. And in VR, I don't know about you all, but I go to various conferences and things that are much more on the industry side sometimes, or just, have people come up and say like, oh, we have VR. And what I hear a lot is in the hype of virtual reality, right? So from the sort of the salespeople of virtual reality is VR is going to be better at whatever the outcome is, right? Because of presence, right? Because it's immersive. There's a quote I'm seeing a lot recently. I want to make sure this doesn't get cut out of context because I don't think this is true for a second. And the quote is, learning outcomes are 75% better in virtual reality. And as someone who teaches in virtual reality, I'd love to believe that, but that is, I don't know any studies. And then they tack, poor Jeremy, they tack Jeremy Bailenson name on that. And I was like, I've never read that in a Jeremy Bailenson piece. I don't think he's ever said that. But it gets into the sales thing. And then you ask the question, why? Why would learning outcomes be better? Oh, because it's immersive. Okay, if that's to be true, we need some sort of theoretical idea that presence and immersion are causal variables. We could create that theory, right? We need to think about why presence and immersion might cause things and what they might cause to get there. Then we're going to need some evidence, right? So we need to do some studies, we need to get some funding, and see if presence and immersion are causal variables for a variety of reasons. We need to identify that presence and immersion are actually affordances of VR. And then we need to understand the user's perceptions of social affordances of VR. And I think actually I kind of have these out of order a bit, right? And so it's sort of, what are the affordances, identifying that it's affordances, the theoretical connection, and then getting some evidence that these things would work. And I think that's what many people in this room and at this conference are working on, is how do these pieces sort of fit together. And so if we want to understand users' perceptions of social affordances of VR, we have to ask them. Apologies to Mel Slater, but we might use a questionnaire or something to be able to get the users' perceptions. And so in 2017, so probably around 2015 or so, Jesse Fox and I worked on this very problem within social media. And I was just saying to Robin in the hall that I stepped into the affordances debate as an interpersonal scholar, not realizing that there was a debate there. And I was like, of course we can measure these. User perceptions, that's how we measure lots of things. That's how we measure liking and trust and satisfaction and relational maintenance behaviors. We'll just, create a questionnaire. And so we had the benefit, though, of a long literature about social media channels, particularly social networking sites, that had already made all of these claims about the affordances that they felt that these channels might have. And so we were able to take the affordances that we saw the most in the literature, create scales, validate those scales against other measures, and then create something that kind of hangs together. So if you look it up, oh, I see. Okay, this changed a little bit. I'm not gonna have my animations, but that's okay. If you look it up, the original scale has 10 synchronicities kind of in there, but these were sort of all of the things that went with social media. And of course, social presence is right there. It's 4 items that we used, validated against Lombard. We could have arguments later about our 4 items versus other measures of social presence, but it's in there as an affordance. This is a bit more of a VR conference than a social media conference. So Cummings and Ingber recently, I'm very jealous of this piece because when I looked at it, I went, oh, we could have done that. But it's probably better that someone else took our scale and independently validated it in some ways, because they compared across lots of different channels, but they looked specifically at virtual reality, specifically at social virtual reality. They surveyed 700 or so people who had used social VR in a head-mounted display at least once a month for the past year. So you had to have some familiarity with VR to be part of their study. And it's going to pop up one by one, but I don't have the animations, so that's okay. So the things that are encircled are the affordances from our scale that was based on social media to start with that show up in social VR. And so social presence is there, great. Bandwidth, which is the idea that I feel like I can exchange emotional cues, right? That is there as well. Personalization, conversational control, this makes sense because this is in line with what we do sort of face-to-face. Anonymity. And then access and network association, I think, are very specific to this sample that they were using. because access is like, I feel like I could pick up this channel, and we see it with texting, usually is very like a high access, higher than face-to-face, because we feel like I could just pick it up and text someone very quickly. And I thought if we were using a general population, access would not score high here, right? These are only the ones that score above 5 on a 1 to 7 scale that I've circled for you. Same thing with network association. I don't like, if we're in a social VR setting and we've just like gotten there, I don't see that as being high on network association, but I think most of their sample is probably Quest users. And then once you're in the Oculus system, there's that secondary thing that is constantly pushing notifications to you, like so-and-so is online. Wouldn't you like to join them? Don't you want to join them in social VR? Here's all your social VR people. And I thought, okay, there it is. And then you have these little stars up here. And what I've done for you with the stars is if you see a red star, then that is where social VR scored higher, not necessarily significantly so, but there is a little bit, the bigger the star, the bigger the difference, than video conferencing, right? Or which would be functionally Zoom today. And so okay, so now here's the constellation of affordances that we have in social VR. And here's where it does better than similar channels that we might choose. And I think face-to-face and video conferencing are the kinds that we probably compare social VR to. So it does a little better on things like access, which is a weird one, personalization, conversational control than video conferencing, and anonymity. And the blue star is the comparison to face-to-face. So doing better on pretty much everything that we were with video conferencing, except personalization. But what are we not doing better on? It's not bandwidth, and it's not social presence, which means that our claim from the hype folks of, well, VR has all this presence, so it's going to be great, it might not hold up well, right? In terms of people choosing this particular channel. Yeah, a ton of time. So I love this Cummings and Inbar piece, so I recommend reading it. This is sort of all of them together, and you can see everything sort of scores highly. But if we think about, okay, what are the affordances that social VR has that don't show up in the Fox and McEwan measure? Because I'm pretty sure that McEwan had not ever even been at a head-mounted display when she was coming up with what are these items supposed to be and what are these factors. And so there might be things that don't show up in the literature for other channels that do matter for social VR. So what we've done, and this is very, very early work, we don't even have all the interviews transcribed. So I've done like a preliminary analysis for you. So if I say something, you're like, that doesn't seem like an affordance, amazing, let's talk about it. Or if something should be renamed, et cetera. But this is sort of what we were seeing. One is this idea of realism. This one's going to change for sure, the name of it. But it's the feeling the participant had of they could or couldn't do the things that they were in the physical world. And what it kind of gets at is it feels like a physical world. It's a kind of skeuomorphic setting to a classroom, but I can't touch the chair, right? And so it's the affordance of the object in the real world isn't translating to the affordance within the environment. And then it's sort of this lack of the affordance of realism. Sometimes extra things, right? I felt like I could fly down the stairs. I felt like I could draw on the board. And sometimes it's things like I can't pick up the object. And I felt like I should be able to pick up that object. We have this sort of sensing, which if you got a chance to try, sorry, people online, if you got a chance to try the confetti people, it's this great idea of sensing that we just got to try at lunch. And you can like high five people and you get this sort of feedback, even though it's not necessarily haptic feedback. But I love this quote here. It felt personal at the end. We high fived and I could feel the vibration. And I am here to tell you that is not a feature in the software that we used. But it shows up in the participants' perception that they felt like that haptic feedback was there. And so again, it's on a continuum. Sometimes like it didn't feel like there was enough feedback. Sometimes there was feedback we didn't expect there to be there. But it's part of how they see that representation, right? It's if I can, how customizable is your avatar? We're using a software called Engage. There's not a ton of choices. And we got it from both the sender and the receiver side in the interviews that we did. So it was both, I I liked that I could represent myself, but also I liked that they had made choices and I could see how they might represent themselves. And so they weren't able to see the other participant. We have a whole thing about you have to come up this stairwell and you come up this stairwell, and they get on the two sides of the lab so they can't see each other. So they have no idea what that person actually looks like, but they liked that they were able to see that sort of representation of them and felt that choosing the avatar was kind of affordance. Embodiment, right? We're back to that idea of embodiment. But in this case, for our participants in our software, a lot of the times the idea of embodiment was that it didn't feel as immersive or present because my hand moved, but my hand didn't move, right? Or like you get this kind of look in the VR. And so it felt kind of weird because of the avatar. I don't think this is an affordance, but it's all over the data. So maybe, right, it's sort of a problem with the lab Wi-Fi. So I do think we have to think about this because I don't think we get stability as an issue with a lot of the other channels we use anymore. We don't get as many dropped calls as we used to. But we had this sort of variation of going through a tunnel, right? So I felt like I was shouting, and that wasn't a nice way to have a conversation. There's some issues with the audio. Sometimes things glitched, and that took them out of the feeling in the study. And so we did get shared space as an affordance, right? I feel like it gives us a place to be together. This could be, I know they're in the next room, showed up a lot, but this could be really interesting if we're far away and we don't have to travel because they hadn't seen each other, right? So they had anonymity. And sometimes participants liked that, right? And we see some things that we see with anonymity in online disinhibition research, right? I had difficulty talking to people, but I thought it was easy in VR because I couldn't see them. It was only their avatar. I felt like I had more confidence to chat with them because I perceived this as anonymous, which works until the study ends and we send them in the hall. There you are. And finally, we did get some social presence, right? So I did feel like that person was there. They were reciprocating the conversation. We walked together and it was just us going through new places, right? They were directed to draw something on the board. So it felt like we were collaborating together. So we did see social presence. So some of these are similar, and I know I don't have a ton of time left. Some of these are similar to the things that we saw in the other studies on affordances that we'd identified. Some of them are new and different. And I think if I was going to make a rough stab at that constellation of affordances, since this is a presence conference, we're getting towards this lodestone of social presence, lodestar, constellations, lodestar of social presence over here, I think they kind of work this way to get us feeling like we have social presence. And so if we're designing for users, we may have to think about all of these other affordances to get to presence. And then we can start asking questions like, okay, then what does presence do for us? But I'm going to end there in the interest of both time and where our research is at right now. Thanks. We have about 3 minutes. Ding ding.
It's Grace. Who has a question for Bree? Asaf first.
I think you can follow up our walking conversation yesterday. So I like the sensing one, the example from the high five, which relates clearly also to Merle's work with the sonified and particularized kind of touch. I think this kind of synesthesia.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether I see why you call it sensing. You think of it from a perspective of the user, but it seems like you think of it like what cognitively or something, whatever design. It's like the synesthetic potential of sometimes, like you're saying, emergent kind of hallucination of an effect is actually there, right? It's synesthetic effect, and I think that's something maybe that it would be an interesting place. Maybe it's already the work is done, but I think between what you do and what Merle is talking, I think this is a really place that makes maybe VR like very potent and very different from all these other channels.
Yeah, I think it really opens up an area of future research and design, right? In that with the thing that's a little bit different about social VR as a channel as well is that you have hardware affordances, software affordances, and social affordances. And so there's that question for the designer, do you have to design in the feature that leads you like down the garden trail to this particular affordance, or will it be something that users will just sort of impute for themselves? And I don't, it's hard to say. So the high five thing comes up, but at the same time, in that particular software, to push a button, you have to go through it. And they really didn't like that. That comes up several times. Like I missed that haptic feedback. And so it's this kind of question of where will the brain just kind of fill things in? I mean, we see this even with texting, right? That was the original, one of the original things with texting was, oh, you can't possibly use it for, relational communication. Clearly we do, we figured it out. And part of what we figured out was this like solipsistic interjection that Joe Walder talks about, where we just fill in the blanks of what the emotional content is supposed to be. And then you can get into all kinds of fun research questions about accuracy, et cetera. I think with sensing, that category, again, I'm not fully convinced we have to think about how that becomes an affordance, the ability to sense something, that haptic feedback. There will be places where people will just fill in the blanks, right? That they suspend, we talked a lot about yesterday about that suspension of belief. And so maybe you don't have the design for all of these things if people kind of bring your own affordances, right, to the environment.
Matthew, quick question.
Great. We do use texting a lot, but not for everything.
Mhm.
So there's certain things I certainly wouldn't do. So the question can be reversed as to what kinds of communication acts work well in a certain way. And that may be interesting to see.
Yeah.
What kinds of communication acts actually.
Yeah, and this is definitely like one of the areas I want to take my research into those outcomes. It's just that like, I felt like we have to do this step first. But we do see that, and we do see this sort of like social norms of a particular channel, right, changing a lot over time, not necessarily matching the way that users perceive the channel and the way they actually use the channel. There's quite a bit of research on texting from to 2010s or so, turn of the century, where you would ask people, what's an appropriate channel to use for this goal, right? Uses in grad studies. And people would say, if it's like breaking up or emotional content, et cetera, they would be like, not texting. But then if you ask people what they actually do, or if you follow them around for a while and figure out what they actually are doing, it's a different story. And so we kind of we'll have to think about this as this sort of research emerges. Because one of the things I am concerned about, having given away my age at a couple of points, is like, let's not repeat all of the mistakes that we made at the beginning of like internet studies and internet research and texting and these kinds of things, and kind of bring this idea of solid communication theorizing, solid thinking about communication processes, affordances, et cetera, to this potentially new communication channel, to really get a better sense of what users might actually do and how perception on the user side influences the way that the channel operates.